Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 19, Section 2. The Vietnam War Divides the Nation. So, we're going to start by talking a little bit about opinion polls. So, in number one, in the spring of 1965, a Gallup poll showed that about 66% of Americans approved of the policy in Vietnam. If you take a look at the graph that's kind of in the lower left-hand corner, it's basically talking about opposition to the war in Vietnam. And really, during the year of 1965, the opposition actually dropped to one of its lowest levels in the entire war. So, for the most part, people were pretty much, supportive of what was going on. As the war goes on, obviously, opposition grows. And a lot of that happens between really 1968 and 69 when we talk about some of the events surrounding the Tet Offensive and some things that were happening back home when we talk about the election of 1968. Number two, the Vietnam War was really the first televised or television war. Every night there was some kind of footage of combat that was appearing in the nightly news. If you take a look at the photograph kind of on the right bottom side here, this is actually a Pulitzer Prize photograph. It's kind of blurry, but it is of an assassination of a Viet Cong gentleman by a member of the South Vietnamese Army. And this was actually shot in actual video, and it did air on television. It was incredibly graphic. These are the things that people back home were watching on their nightly news. And the footage obviously had a huge impact on how people felt about the war as the war continued on. But as a result of having things televised and taking lots of opinion polls, we start getting into something called a credibility gap. General William Westmoreland, who was the head commander of American troops that were stationed in Vietnam, often reported that the enemy was on the verge of defeat. And he constantly said this throughout the course of his tenure in Vietnam. But what we were seeing on the news reports at home often contradicted what he had to say. And what we get is something called a credibility gap. Really, people are still talking about credibility gaps when we talk about information that comes out of politics and what is being reported in the media. This has been going on really for the last 50 years since the Vietnam War. Moving on. Number three, although he had created the policy known as containment, American diplomat George Kennan argued that the Vietnam War was not strategically important. And if you think about it, Vietnam was not necessarily a trading partner on the scale of maybe some other nations. For the most part, it wasn't necessarily geographically loaded or located in a vicinity close to other nations that were of great concern to the United States. And yet we made it a very important target during this period of time. Number four, a group of faculty members in March of 1965 and students as well at the University of Chicago gathered together to join in on what was called the first teach-in, which was an opportunity to gather people to discuss their opposition to the war. A couple months later, in May of 65, over 122 colleges throughout the United States held what was known as the National Teach-In by radio. And they had an audience of over 100,000 anti-war demonstrators. And it was one of the first opportunities for college-age individuals to gather together to talk about their opposition to this war. Number five, minorities, particularly African Americans, made up a disproportionately large number of soldiers in Vietnam. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the draft here. And I want to use some information here just so that we're not necessarily getting the wrong side of the story here, but uh, during the Vietnam War, we had a lottery system. And what would happen is we would use the month and the number of the day that a person was born. And on a grid, they would, for the most part, post the numbers for individuals who are obviously up for the draft. The lower the number, the higher your choices or chances of being drafted. So, for example, if an individual had a lottery number of 365, chances are they were not going to be called up. But if an individual had a lottery number lower than 100, there was a pretty good chance that they might be called up for a draft. Okay. Many college age students were able to avoid the draft. And this is where a lot of people get kind of upset about the Vietnam War and the draft and all this. And yes, it is true that um, individuals could get what we call a deferment, which was handed out to individuals who were college students, fully enrolled, as long as they were full-time students. For the most part, it could keep them from being drafted. Before the war ends, that does change. But at the start of the war, that was something that encouraged a lot of young people, particularly young males, to go to college if they wanted to avoid being drafted. Other things that could keep a person from being drafted, if an individual was a father at a young age, or if they had a medical issue, in some cases religious. So if an individual was of a certain religious denomination which denounces war, so for example, like Jehovah Witnesses, or if you were perhaps maybe a Catholic man who was entering the seminary, these are things that might have kept an individual out of the ranks of the draftees. There are other different types of deferments. Some of them were based on mental illness and sexuality and things of that nature as well. But the average age of a draftee during the Vietnam War was roughly age 19. But the truth is, about two-thirds of all the servicemen that served in Vietnam were actually volunteers. And the military itself had a lot of people in it during the years that the Vietnam War was kind of at its height. Uh, 8.7 million people served in the military between 1965 and 1973, but only 1.8 million of that total actually got there because of the draft. And when we talk about the Vietnam War, there were 2.7 million military personnel who served in the country of Vietnam. So, I mean, it is possible that a person could enter into the military during these years and still not end up in Vietnam. Okay. When we talk about African Americans and kind of going back to that issue, um, between about 1961 and 1966, about 10% of the military at that time comprised of African Americans. When you look at the overall population of the United States at that period of time, African Americans made up about 13% of the population. When the draft is going on, of those soldiers that are drafted or men that are drafted in, it was more probable that if you were an African American, that you would be assigned to a combat unit. And that is where the issue lies right there, is how the assignments were handed out. So in April of 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. broke his silence and publicly condemned the conflict in Vietnam. And part of that was because of how African Americans were being assigned to combat. Not to say that, you know, um, there weren't people that were African Americans that didn't volunteer to go. There were volunteers, but I think Dr. King thought that it was a situation where African Americans were disproportionately assigned to those units. By 1968, the nation was divided into two different camps. We had a group of people known as the Doves who wanted to withdraw from Vietnam, And we had another group known as the Hawks who wanted to stay and fight. What's interesting is Hawks and Doves are not necessarily defined by political parties. There were Doves who were Republicans, and there were Doves who were Democrats, as there were Hawks who were Republicans and Hawks that were Democrats. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your political affiliation, for the most part, determined whether you're a Hawk or a Dove. But I think a lot of times we think of Doves being probably more with the Democratic Party and the Hawks being more with Republicans. Number 8, protests against the war and the draft led to the ratification of the 26th Amendment. This amendment gave individuals who were 18 years and older the right to vote. And part of that was the fact that if you remember, our average age of our draft was 19. Before the ratification of the 26th Amendment, the average, the youngest you could be to vote was age 21. And so if you were a draftee, chances are you would have served your time in the military and had probably been discharged before you were actually able to vote in a federal election. So by dropping that to 18, it seemed to be very fair for a lot of folks. What's interesting is that proportionately, 18-year-olds are probably the lowest number or lowest group of people who actually participate in elections. And it's kind of been that way for really for decades, really since the ratification of the 26th Amendment. Number 9, the Tet Offensive, for the most part, was a massive surprise attack by the Viet Cong on American bases in South Vietnam and most of South Vietnam's major cities. This offensive actually took place starting on January 30th, 1968, and kind of lasting several weeks into the beginning of February of 68. This was lined up with the Vietnamese New Year, and as a result, we had a coordinated a guerrilla attack that happened throughout the South. As a result, militarily, this really was a disaster for the Viet Cong. They were defeated, time and time again. But if you're looking at it from the way the media reported this event, it really became a disaster for guys like Lyndon B. Johnson and for those people who were really wanting to support the war in Vietnam. What's interesting is that LBJ went on TV, delivered an address saying that for the VC, this event had ended literally in complete failure for those folks. But the North Vietnamese scored that political victory because of the TV coverage. General Westmoreland, certainly after the Tet Offensive, had requested that the government send additional troops to Vietnam, and some people saw that as kind of a sign that maybe the war was not winnable unless we had more troops. To go along with that, there were certainly a lot of folks that put a lot of hope and aspirations into the words of some of our newscasters. In number 11, even Walter Cronkite, who you see pictured below. Cronkite was the anchorman for the CBS Nightly News and probably one of the most trusted and beloved newscasters of his generation. But he basically made a commentary saying that he thought the war was going to end in a stalemate. And for a lot of Americans, that's exactly when their support for the war vanished. And a lot of people say that Cronkite had a lot of responsibility in that. Number 12. Violence seemed to plague the country at every turn in 1968, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and also the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Just to kind of let you know what was happening in 1968, we have a presidential election. And what's interesting is shortly after the Tet Offensive, and about the time that the media is reporting that the war is not going to end in anything but a stalemate, Lyndon B. Johnson goes on television one night in March of '68 to announce that he is not going to seek reelection. And some people see that as kind of a sign of weakness, that the Democrats are admitting that they can't win the war. As a result of that, there are Democratic candidates that are coming in to fill the void and try to run for election, particularly a guy named Eugene McCarthy. He was a Minnesota um, member of Congress. He had been a dove for the most part, ran in the New Hampshire primary, and actually um, scored a pretty big victory over LBJ before he withdrew from the race. But after LBJ leaves, Robert Kennedy enters the ring, and he has a lot of support. A lot of people who really enjoyed his brother kind of put a lot of support into Robert Kennedy. Along with that, you had Hubert Humphrey, again, also from Minnesota. Humphrey was Lyndon B. Johnson's vice president, and he also throws his hat into the ring. So these assassinations that took place, um, Martin Luther King Jr. is happening on April 4th, 1968. He was assassinated by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray. And then Robert Kennedy's happening on June 5th, 1968, by an Arab nationalist known as Sirhan Sirhan. These assassinations literally sparked chaos and rioting and all sorts of awful things happening in a lot of our urban areas. Um, Violence associated with the Democratic Party convention that happened in Chicago only benefited the Republicans. And the man who's going to run as a Republican in 1968 is no other than Richard Nixon. Nixon in '68 really comes across as being really a stabilizing force. A lot of people see him as, bringing back maybe some of the old values of our nation. The opinion polls really loved Richard Nixon. So it's kind of interesting because in a few years they're going to turn against him when we start getting into the Watergate times. But Nixon did promise when he was on the campaign trail that he would try to unify our nation and he would restore law and order, but probably more importantly, that he was going to try to find a way to end the war in Vietnam. And people held him accountable for that. Running as an independent, you had George Wallace. George Wallace was a former governor from Alabama. During the height of the civil rights movement, he made a big stand at the University of Alabama to stop integration. And he won 46% of the electoral votes, which is a huge percentage for a third party candidate, and more than 13% of the popular vote in 1968. He's going to try to run again in 1972, and he's going to be shot, not assassinated, but paralyzed as a result of that. When we talk about kind of the wrap up of the election, Richard Nixon wins the '68 election with more than 100 electoral votes, really solidifying his support. And if you take a look at the map here, really a good portion of the western United States and the Midwest really threw its support behind Nixon during this campaign. Thank you very much.